Homefront, a focus on women. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, America was in no state to participate in the fighting. In early 1941, the Lend-Lease policy contributed to the growing capacity for military production. Quote, in the wake of Pearl Harbor, the president set staggering goals for the nation's factories: 60,000 aircraft in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943, 120,000 tanks in the same time period, and 55,000 anti-aircraft guns, end quote, PBS. Women were able to find work in large numbers and across many fields. They were used in industrial manufacturing, were able to serve in the military, were able to serve as ferrying pilots, were used in large numbers as code breakers, and many other roles. People of color faced discrimination in getting jobs in war production and government jobs. Executive Order 8802 led to increased job opportunities due to protections against racial discrimination in hiring. This was a step toward in the Double V campaign for victory at home and abroad, and provided opportunities for Black women to work in war industries. The Axis was overwhelmingly outproduced by the Allied powers. Germany and Japan were both slow to utilize their total population and resources for their war effort. This delay, spurred on by their plan to exploit the resource and people of conquered territories, was a critical misstep. They were also hindered by the interrupted flow of transportation of resources from outer areas due to Allied bombing and submarine attacks. The federal government took steps to conserve crucial supplies such as food, shoes, metal, paper, and rubber that were needed by the military and civilians, including establishing a rationing system that impacted virtually every family in the United States. Rationing extended to all aspects of American life, from tires to coffee, from gasoline to sugar. The government encouraged women and others to plant victory gardens to supplement their diets. Rationing and victory gardens were ways for ordinary Americans to contribute to the war efforts. The war images transition into women portrayed as mothers to an essential element of the war effort, helping with the production and assembly of war materials. Various photos on covers of a Japanese weekly photographic journal showed the progression or timeline of the war, with the focus on combat to a focus on women as a symbol of pride and hope as the expectations of women shifted. Women were employed with weaving textiles and other goods that supported the war effort. World War II compounded the shortage of food for the military, the government, and the citizens of Japan. The prominent axiom, quote, sacrifice as a nation for the good of the empire. But the Japanese army and navy were prioritized before the citizens for food. Japanese food rations for their soldiers included canned meat, canned fish, soy sauce, bean paste, rice, tea, and chocolate. The number of Japanese citizens that suffered from malnutrition and disease as the years progressed with the war were significant due to Japan's limited resources and dependency of imports on goods. For Germany, female auxiliaries were an essential aspect of the German military. The women were identified as only helpers and therefore were not provided military status. Hitler did not want to utilize German women in the production of goods to support the effort, as he thought they would become disloyal to him. Instead, Hitler exploited laborers from other countries. Ukrainians and Polish people only encompassed a few of the population forced into labor for Germany. Prior to World War II, Germany had already pushed a diet that was adjusted to wartime: potatoes and cornbread and casseroles, or one-pot dishes. The one-pot dishes were pushed more as the war ensued. The casseroles were more fuel-efficient and could exploit lower quality cuts of meat. German soldiers were encouraged to survive from the land when in combat, seizing goods and foods from civilians along route, but prepared rations were also prepared and transported, delivered by drop canisters or by troops. Before World War II, Japanese women were urged to live according to the saying, produce more babies and increase the population. In the commercial sector, the labor provided by women became the key to the country's economic success. During World War II, their role changed. With their husbands gone, wives were now in complete control of the home and found themselves doing double and sometimes triple duty. After the war, there was a, quote, general leveling down throughout the social structure of Japan. Women's suffrage came in 1946, and all inequalities and laws were ended. German women achieved suffrage in 1919. Women began to fill jobs usually held by men, as well as professions such as teaching, social work, and secretarial work. During the war, girls were taught all good German women married at a young age to a proper German, and that the wife's task was to keep a decent home for her working husband and to have children. The Gold Cross went to women who had produced 8 children. Silver was for 6, and bronze was for 4. In America, before World War II, women that worked were typically young, single, and self-supported. Married women typically stayed at home. If they did work, they were in jobs seen as women's jobs. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. committed itself to total war. Women worked in defense plants and volunteered for war-related organizations. Nearly 350,000 served in uniform. General Eisenhower said, quote, "The contribution of the women of America, whether on the farm or in the factory or in uniform to D-Day, was a sine qua non of the invasion effort." At the war's end, many women were forced out by men returning home and by the downturn in demand for war materials. Women veterans encouraged roadblocks when they tried to take advantage to benefit programs for veterans like the GI Bill. The nation was not yet ready for the greater social equality that would slowly come in the decades to follow. Wartime shortages meant that many women were needed in an industry. In order to rally women together to increase production in the U.S., propaganda was created to glamorize women going to work. Propaganda was mainly targeted at women who had never worked outside of the home before. Traditionally beautiful, note white, women were shown with makeup on, smiling with patriotic symbols and colors, urging women to join the workforce. Quote, "These jobs will have to be glorified as a patriotic war service if American women are to be persuaded to take them and stick to them. Their importance to a nation engaged in total war must be convincingly presented." One of the most iconic photos of U.S. propaganda during World War II is Rosie the Riveter. Although she is dressed in a Riveter's uniform, she is still well-groomed, feminine-looking, wearing makeup, and patriotically saying, "We can do it." This is yet another example of propaganda geared towards women in the U.S. Beyond getting women to work in industry, the U.S. was also in dire need of civilians rationing, growing their own victory gardens, and conserving materials such as rubber, oil, sugar, butter, and meat. Note the well-manicured hand pouring grease into explosives, indicating that conservation leads to supplies for the war. Famous Hollywood actresses were recruited by the Office of War Information to star in films glamorizing and boosting patriotism. Both Germany and Japan utilized women in propaganda, whether it was through photography, cinema, or radio. Women demonstrated ideal conduct as well as spoke against the Allies. Photography was used to reinforce wartime behavior for women that included watching for air raids as well as practicing bucket brigades and wearing gas masks. In addition, photographs encouraged Japanese women to support the war effort, whether making a, quote, 1,000-stitch band or rice balls during an air raid drill. For Germany, the ideal Aryan woman was physically fit. Photos such as these were common. Under Joseph Goebbels' tutelage, German cinema became an arm of state propaganda. Some movies, like the romantic musical drama Request Concert, demonstrated the theme of German civilians and soldiers selflessly giving all for the war effort. Often, German films showed their enemies as evil and barbaric, assaulting German maidens. In addition, Nazi cinema depicted attitudes expected of Germans, such as stoically enduring the bombardment of towns. In Der Judas, the Aryan woman who submitted to the villainous Justus Oppenheimer later commits suicide because she has been defiled by a non-Aryan. The well-known Nazi sympathizer, Leni Riefenstahl, produced and directed two masterpieces of Nazi propaganda, Triumph of the Will and Olympia. Both films extol the virtues of the Third Reich. Like Germany, Japan's film industry produced national policy propaganda films. Actresses would portray Chinese women with a romantic interest in Japanese soldiers, symbolizing Japan's benevolence towards China. The Most Beautiful bucked the traditional role of women, showing them working in an optics factory, trying to maintain production and encouraging the patriotism of total war. The most well-known example of Japanese radio propaganda was Orphan Anne, voiced by the American citizen Aiba Toguri, one of dozens of English-speaking women collectively known as Tokyo Rose. Her playful tone undermined the demoralizing intent of the messages. Germany likewise utilized English-language propaganda. Axis Sally, the GI-bestowed nickname of U.S. citizen Mildred Giller's, broadcast anti-American propaganda. Unlike Toguri's light tone, Giller's tone was much more mocking. American GIs viewed both roles not as demoralizing, but as entertainment.